This is your government video on federal mandates. Federal mandates are just like the word sounds, when the federal government mandates or requires that state governments do something. This is one of the downsides of federalism. Federalism separates our government into both federal and state government, and sometimes the two governments disagree with one another. And sometimes the federal government wants to force their power onto the states, and states, of course, don't like this. They believe that they have states' rights. So one of these conflicts is when the federal government passes mandates. And a federal mandate is a law passed by Congress, which creates a requirement among the states in return typically for federal money. Although sometimes they do pass federal mandates which are unfunded, those are even more problematic because that would mean the federal government is forcing the states to do something, and the states have to come up with their own money to pay for it. But typically a federal mandate means here's a federal law, you have to impose it, but we're also going to give you a chunk of money to do it. And sometimes that chunk of money is really large. Sometimes it's 80 or 90% of the money it would take to solve that problem. And they grant the money to states that way. But states still do not necessarily like it when the federal government intermingles in what they perceive as state responsibility. So the goal for the federal government is typically to force compliance. They believe that a particular law would be best suited if everybody in the whole country followed that same law. And the only way to make sure that everybody is doing something that would help the entire country is to legislate it and do it with a federal government law. Sometimes they do pass these federal laws, and sometimes they use these mandates forcing the states to implement their own state law. Federal mandates and this mingling of responsibility between federal and state government is super inefficient. We as taxpayers pay taxes to both the federal government and the state government. And sometimes we're paying those same parts of our government to do the exact same things. We're paying a Department of Education, Energy, Housing on the federal level as well as the state level. Sometimes those two entities that we're paying taxes to are working against each other or working together for the same goal. Either way, we're paying double for something. So it is very inefficient. And the cost of making sure that the state government checks and balances the federal and the federal checks and balances the state. Of course, we want to do this because we don't want tyrannical government, but we're basically paying two sets of taxes to ensure that. Because it's inefficient, it's also more costly to the taxpayer. We've got multiple state laws. There's 50 states, so you could have 50 separate state laws, plus you could have a federal law. Plus, you can have multiple federal laws. So sometimes you get really repetitive actions that either do the exact same thing or work in contrast to one another. It is also incredibly time consuming because if you want to get something done and you want it to be everywhere in the country, you either have to go from state to state 50 times to make sure that it gets done, or you have to impose this type of federal mandate and then force it amongst the states, but some states might not like it, so they could sue you in court to try to ban the federal government from doing this. That's costing money, that's costing time, that's costing resources. So here are some important examples of federal mandates that you will need to know. The first one we're going to talk about is the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is a major act that was passed. It started out as a way to make buildings handicapped accessible. So it used to not be required that buildings had things like wheelchair ramps or doors you could push a button to automatically open, or that doorways were even wide enough for wheelchairs. Americans with Disabilities Act creates these things, and it originally said that all new construction buildings had to abide by disability codes from now on, so that doorways were wider. Things like hotels, for example, had to have at least a few rooms that were accessible for people who were blind or deaf, and they had things like phones and other types of technologies in them that would help hotel guests who had certain types of disabilities. It now also is required that all government buildings have to be ADA accessible. So even if a building is really old and maybe it's historic, if it is a government building, then the people that you govern, including people with disabilities, have to be able to access their government. And this is also why we have things like handicap parking spaces, which are close to the door or wider so that certain types of handicap vehicles can be parked there. But that is the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was a federal mandate, meaning the federal government passed it and then required states to abide by it without the states say so. The next one we're going to talk about, we're actually going to talk about two at the same time, are the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. Just like these sound, these were meant to create a federal standard of what a minimum amount of clean air and clean water are, so that we could obviously breathe clean air and that we could, our drinking water is safe. These were passed in the 70s under the Nixon administration. I know when we talk today about clean air and clean water and environmentalism and global warming, we typically think of liberals or conservatives, environmentalists. But it was actually the Republican conservatives and Nixon who championed the Environmental Protection Agency. He started it under his administration. And at the time, it was conservatives who saw protecting clean air and clean water and protecting our resources as a business argument, because businesses used natural resources, and if we conserved them and we didn't use them up too quickly, that would be more beneficial to businesses. And so the environmental laws were really created under a Republican umbrella during Nixon. And then over time, I think it was around the 80s where the liberal movement and Democrats started to get on the bandwagon of environmentalism. And of course, things have changed a little bit since then. But the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act are still federal requirements mandating a minimum amount of limiting pollution in our air and water. And states, of course, can have stricter standards, but the federal one is the mandate that exists all across the country.